Hello, and welcome back to the Book Service Podcast. There is much to be said about the power of storytelling. Sometimes, a story that is only a few pages long can have a deeper, longer-lasting effect than one that runs to 1,000 pages. Short stories offer us a glimpse into the lives of other people, but only, it seems, for a moment in time. Because of their brevity, short stories have a peculiarity about them. They are, in a sense, quite mystical. When the story has ended, we come out of that world in which we have witnessed one of life's mysteries, and are left to wonder at its significance, for the characters, and perhaps for ourselves. The series I present to you will feature readings of short fiction, which are narrated by the librarians at the Stoneham Public Library. This is Slices of Life. Chess Story by Stefan Zweig. On the great passenger steamer, due to depart New York for Buenos Aires at midnight, there was the usual last-minute bustle and commotion. Visitors from shore shoved confusedly to see their friends off. Telegraph boys in cocked caps dashed through the lounges shouting names. Trunks and flowers were carried past, and inquisitive children ran up and down the companionways, the orchestra playing imperturbably on deck all the while. As I was standing a bit apart from this hubbub, talking on the promenade deck with an acquaintance of mine, 2 or 3 flashbulbs flared near us. Apparently, the press had been quickly interviewing and photographing some celebrity just before we sailed. My friend glanced over and smiled. "That's a rare bird you've got on board. That's Czentovic." I must have received this news with a rather blank look, for he went on to explain, "Mirko Czentovic, the world chess champion. He's crisscrossed America from coast to coast, playing tournaments, and is now off to Argentina for fresh triumphs." In fact, I now recalled this young world champion and even some details of his meteoric career. My friend, a more assiduous reader of newspapers than I, was able to add a number of anecdotes. About a year previously, Czentovic had overnight entered the ranks of the greatest masters of the art of chess, such as Alekhine, Capablanca, Tartakova, Lasker, and Bogolyubov. Not since the appearance of 7-year-old prodigy Reshevsky at the New York chess tournament of 1922 had the penetration of a complete unknown into that circle of luminaries caused such a wide sensation. For Czentovic's intellectual traits certainly did not seem to promise a dazzling career. It soon emerged that, chess champion or not, in private, Czentovic was unable to write a correctly spelled sentence in any language, and, as one of his irritated peers jibed, his ignorance was just as absolute in every other area. Czentovic's father, a penniless Yugoslavian Danube bargeman, had been killed in his tiny boat when it was crushed one night by a grain steamer in a remote area. The 12-year-old boy had then been taken in by the local parson out of pity. The good reverend coached him at home, doing his level best to make up for what the lumpish, taciturn, broad-browed boy was unable to learn at the village school. But the parson's efforts were in vain. The letters of the alphabet had been explained to the boy 100 times, yet still he stared at them as though he had never seen them before. No matter how simple the subject, his brain labored heavily, but retained nothing. At the age of 14, he still counted on his fingers, and though he was now an adolescent, he could read books and newspapers only with great difficulty. Yet Mirko could not be called reluctant or willful. He obediently did what was asked, carried water, split wood, helped in the fields, cleaned the kitchen, and reliably, though with annoying slowness, finished any task he was given. But what irritated the good parson most about the awkward boy was his total apathy. He did nothing, unless specifically told to, never asked a question, did not play with other boys, and undertook no activity that had not been explicitly assigned to him. Once Mirko had finished his chores, he sat around listlessly indoors with the vacant look of sheep at pasture, taking not the slightest interest in what went on around him. While the parson, puffing on his long peasant pipe, played his usual 3 evening games of chess with the local constable, the lank-haired blond boy squatted silently beside them and gazed at the checkered board from beneath his heavy eyelids, seemingly somnolent and indifferent. One winter evening, while the 2 players were engrossed in their daily game, the jingle of sleigh bells came from the village street, approaching with greater and greater speed. A peasant, his cap dusted with snow, stumped in hurriedly. His old mother was dying, and he wanted the parson to hurry so that he would be in time to administer the last rites. The parson followed without hesitation. As he was leaving, the constable, who was still drinking his beer, lit a fresh pipe and was preparing to pull on his heavy-top boots when he noticed that Mirko's gaze was riveted on the chessboard with the unfinished game. "So, you want to play it out, do you?" he said jokingly, completely convinced that the sleepy boy did not know how to move a single piece on the board correctly. The boy looked up shyly, then nodded and took the parson's chair. After 14 moves, the constable had been beaten, and he had to admit, through no careless error of his own. The second game ended no differently. "Balaam's ass!" exclaimed the astounded parson upon his return, explaining to the constable, who was not so well versed in the Bible, that by a similar miracle 2,000 years ago, a dumb creature had suddenly found the power of intelligent speech. In spite of the late hour, the parson could not refrain from challenging his semi-literate famulus. Mirko beat him too with ease. He played doggedly, slowly, stolidly, without once lifting his bowed broad forehead from the board. But he played with unassailable certainty. During the days to come, neither the constable nor the parson was able to win a game against him. The parson, who knew better than anyone how backward his pupil was in other respects, now became curious in earnest as to how far this one strange talent might withstand a more rigorous test. After having Mirko's unkempt blonde hair cut at the village barber's to make him somewhat presentable, he took him in his sleigh to the small neighboring city where, in a corner of the cafe in the main square, there were chess enthusiasts for whom, as he had found, he himself was no match. There was no small stir among them when the parson pushed the tow-headed, rosy-cheeked 15-year-old in his fur-lined sheepskin jacket and heavy high-top boots into the coffee house, where, ill at ease, The boy stood in a corner with shyly downcast eyes until someone called him over to one of the chess tables. Mirko lost against his first opponent because he had never seen the Sicilian opening in the good Parsons game. He drew the second game against the best player. From the third and fourth games on, he beat all his opponents, one after another. Now, it is rare that anything exciting happens in a small provincial city in Yugoslavia, and the first appearance of this rustic champion caused an instant sensation among those in attendance. There was unanimous agreement that the boy wonder must definitely remain in the city until the next day, so that the other members of the chess club could be assembled, and especially so that old Count Simjic, a chess fanatic, could be reached at his castle. The parson looked at his ward with a pride that was quite new, but, for all his joy of discovery, he still did not wish to neglect his duty to perform the Sunday services. He declared himself willing to leave Mirko behind for a further test. The young Czentovic was put up in the hotel at the chess club's expense and saw a water closet that evening for the first time. The next afternoon, the chess room in the cafe was jammed. Mirko, sitting motionless in front of the board for 4 hours, defeated one player after another without uttering a word or even looking up. Finally, a simultaneous game was proposed. It took some time to make the ignorant boy understand that in a simultaneous game he would be the only opponent of a range of players. But once Mirko had grasped this, he quickly warmed to the task. He moved slowly from table to table, his heavy shoes squeaking, and in the end, won 7 of the 8 games. At this point, great deliberations began. Although this new champion was not, strictly speaking, a resident, regional pride was keenly aroused just the same. Perhaps the small city, whose presence on the map had hardly ever been noticed, could finally boast of an international celebrity. An agent by the name of Koller, who otherwise represented nobody but chanteuses and cabaret singers employed at the garrison, announced that, in return for a year's subsidy, he would arrange to have the young man given professional training in the art of chess by an excellent minor master of his acquaintance in Vienna. Count Simjic, who in 60 years of daily play had never encountered such a remarkable opponent, immediately underwrote the amount. After half a year, Mirko had mastered all the secrets of chess technique, though with a peculiar limitation that was later to be much noted and ridiculed in professional circles. For Czentovic never managed to play a single game by memory alone, blind, as the professionals say. He completely lacked the ability to situate the field of battle in the unlimited realm of the imagination. He always needed to have the board with its 64 black and white squares and 32 pieces physically in front of him. Even when he was world famous, he carried a folding pocket chess set with him at all times so that, if he wanted to reconstruct a game or solve a problem, he would be able to examine the positions of the pieces by eye. This failing, in itself minor, betrayed a lack of imaginative power and was the subject of lively discussion in elite circles, of the sort that might be heard among musicians if a prominent virtuoso or conductor had proven himself unable to play or conduct without an open score. But this strange idiosyncrasy did nothing whatever to slow Mirko's stupendous climb. At 17, he had already won a dozen prizes. At 18, the Hungarian Championship, and at 20, he was champion of the world. The most audacious grandmasters, every one of them infinitely superior to him in intellectual gifts, imagination, and daring, fell to his cold and inexorable logic, as Napoleon to the ponderous Kutuzov, or Hannibal to Fabius Cunctator, who, according to Livy's report, displayed similar conspicuous traits of phlegm and imbecility in childhood. Thus, it happened that the illustrious gallery of chess champions, including among their number the most varied types of superior intellect, philosophers, mathematicians, people whose natural talents were computational, imaginative, often creative, was for the first time invaded by a total outsider to the intellectual world, a dull, taciturn peasant lad, from whom even the craftiest newspaper men were never able to coax a single word of any journalistic value. Of course, what Czentovic denied the newspapers in the way of polished sentences was soon amply compensated for in anecdotes about his person. For the instant he stood up from the chessboard, where he was without peer, Czentovic became an irredeemably grotesque, almost comic figure. Despite his solemn black suit, his splendid cravat with its somewhat showy pearl stickpin, and his painstakingly manicured fingernails, his behavior and manners remained those of the simple country boy who had once swept out the parson's room in the village. To the amusement and annoyance of his professional peers, he was artless, and almost brazen in extracting, with a miserly, even vulgar greed, what money he could from his talent and fame. He traveled from city to city, always staying in the cheapest hotels. He played in the most pathetic clubs, as long as they paid his fee. He permitted himself to appear in soap advertisements, and even, ignoring the mockery of his competitors, who knew quite well that he couldn't put 3 sentences together, sold his name for use on the cover of a philosophy of chess, which had actually been written for the enterprising publisher by an insignificant Galician student. Like all headstrong types, Czentovic had no sense of the ridiculous. Ever since his triumph in the World Tournament, he considered himself the most important man in the world, and the awareness that he had beaten all these clever, intellectual, brilliant speakers and writers on their own ground, and above all the evident fact that he made more money than they did, transformed his original lack of self-confidence into a cold pride that for the most part he did not trouble to hide. But why wouldn't such a rapid rise to fame send an empty head like that into a spin? Concluded my friend, who had just related some classic examples of Czentovic's childishly authoritative manner. Why wouldn't a 21-year-old country boy from the Banat start putting on airs when pushing some pieces around on a wooden board is suddenly earning him more in a week than his whole village back home makes an entire year of woodcutting and the most back-breaking drudgery? And actually, isn't it damn easy to think you're a great man if you aren't troubled by the slightest notion that a Rembrandt, Beethoven, Dante, or Napoleon ever existed? This lad has just one piece of knowledge in his blinkered brain, that he hasn't lost a single chess game in months. And since he has no idea that there's anything of value in the world other than chess and money, he has every reason to be pleased with himself. My friend's observations did not fail to arouse a special curiosity in me. All my life, I have been passionately interested in monomaniacs of any kind, people carried away by a single idea. The more one limits oneself, the closer one is to the infinite. These people, as unworldly as they seem, burrow like termites into their own particular material, to construct, in miniature, a strange and utterly individual image of the world. Thus, I made no secret of my intention to subject this odd specimen of a one-track mind to a closer examination during the 12-day voyage to Rio. But my friend warned, "You won't have much luck. As far as I know, no one has yet succeeded in getting anything of the slightest psychological interest out of Czentovic. That wily peasant is tremendously shrewd behind all his abysmal limitations. He never lets anything slip, thanks to the simple technique of avoiding all conversation, except with compatriots of his from the same walk of life, people he finds in small hotels. When he senses an educated person, he crawls into his shell. That way, no one will ever be able to boast of having heard him say something stupid, or of having plumbed the depths of his seemingly boundless ignorance." And in fact, my friend would turn out to be right. During the first few days of the voyage, it proved to be entirely impossible to approach Czentovic short of roughly thrusting myself upon him, which all things considered is not in my line. He did sometimes stride across the promenade deck, but always with a bearing of proud self-absorption, hands clasped behind him, like Napoleon in the famous pose. Then, too, he always made his tour of the deck so hurriedly and propulsively that it would have been necessary to pursue him at a trot in order to accost him. Nor did he ever show himself in the lounges, the bar, or the smoking room. As the steward informed me in response to a discreet inquiry, he spent the greater part of the day in his cabin, practicing or reviewing chess games on a bulky board. After 3 days, I was beginning to be truly annoyed that his dogged defenses were outmaneuvering my determination to get near him. I had never in my life had an opportunity to make the personal acquaintance of a chess champion, and the more I now sought to form an impression of such a temperament, the more unimaginable appeared to me a mind absorbed for a lifetime in a domain of 64 black and white squares. From my own experience, I was well aware of the mysterious attraction of the royal game, which, alone among the games devised by man, regally eschews the tyranny of chance and awards its palms of victory only to the intellect, or rather, to a certain type of intellectual gift. But is it not already an insult to call chess anything so narrow as a game? Is it not also a science, an art, hovering between these categories like Muhammad's coffin between heaven and earth, a unique yoking of opposites, ancient and yet eternally new, mechanically constituted and yet an activity of the imagination alone, limited to a fixed geometric area, but unlimited in its permutations, constantly evolving and yet sterile, a cogitation producing nothing, a mathematics calculating nothing, an art without an artwork, an architecture without substance and yet demonstrably more durable in its essence and actual form than all books and works, the only game that belongs to all peoples and all eras, while no one knows what God put it on earth to deaden boredom, sharpen the mind, and fortify the spirit? Where does it begin? Where does it end? Any child can learn its basic rules. Any amateur can try his hand at it. And yet, within the inalterable confines of a chessboard, masters unlike any others evolve. People with a talent for chess and chess alone, special geniuses whose gifts of imagination, patience, and skill are just as precisely apportioned as those of mathematicians, poets, and musicians, but differently arranged and combined. In earlier times, when there was a rage for physiognomy, a Gaul might have dissected the brains of such chess champions to determine whether there was a special convolution in their gray matter, a kind of chest muscle or chest bump, more strongly marked than in the skulls of others. And how excited such a physiognomist would have been by the case of a Czentovic, in whom this narrow genius seems embedded in absolute intellectual inertia, like a single gold thread in 100 weight of barren rock. In principle, I have always found it easy to understand that such a unique, ingenious game would have to produce its own wizards. Yet, how difficult, how impossible it is to imagine the life of an intellectually active person who reduces the world to a shuttle between black and white, who seeks fulfillment in a mere to and fro, forward and back of 32 pieces, someone for whom a new opening that allows the knight to be advanced instead of the pawn is in itself a great accomplishment and a meager little piece of immortality in a corner of a chess book. Someone with a brain in his head who, without going mad, continues over and over for 10, 20, 30, 40 years to devote all the force of his thought to the ridiculous end of cornering a wooden king on a wooden board. And now, that one such phenomenon, one such strange genius or mysterious simpleton was for the first time physically quite nearby, 6 cabins away from me on the same ship, alas. I, for whom curiosity about things of the mind is more and more becoming a kind of passion, was unable to approach him. I began to think up the most absurd ruses. I would tickle his vanity by pretending to interview him for an important newspaper, perhaps, or pique his avarice by proposing a lucrative tournament in Scotland. But finally, I remembered a hunter's trick, that the most reliable technique for decoying the wood grouse was to imitate its mating call. What could be more effective in attracting the attention of a chess champion than to play chess oneself? Now, I have never in my life been a serious chess player. My dealings with the game have been purely frivolous, for pleasure alone. If I spend an hour in front of the board, this is by no means to exert myself, but, on the contrary, to relieve emotional tension. I play chess in the truest sense, while the others, the real chess players, work it, if I may use the word in this daring new way. But in chess, as in love, a partner is indispensable, and at that time I did not yet know if there were other chess lovers on board apart from us. To lure them out of their holes, I laid a primitive trap in the smoking room. Though my wife's game is even weaker than my own, she and I, the bird catchers, sat at a chessboard. And in fact, someone passing through paused for a moment before we had made even 6 moves, and a second asked permission to look on. Finally, the desired partner turned up too, and challenged me to a game. His name was McConnor, a Scottish civil engineer who, as I soon heard, had made a fortune in oil drilling in California. To the eye, he was a thick-set individual with heavy, well-defined, almost rectilinear jowls, strong teeth, and a high complexion whose pronounced ruddiness was probably at least partly due to plenty of whiskey. The strikingly broad, almost athletically powerful shoulders unfortunately reflected the character of his playing too, for this Mr. McConnor was one of those self-obsessed bigwheels who feel personally diminished by a defeat in even the most trivial game. Accustomed to ruthlessly asserting himself in life and spoiled by actual success, this unyielding self-made man was so unshakably imbued with a sense of his own superiority that any resistance infuriated him, as though it were some inadmissible revolt, practically an affront. When he lost the first game, he grew sullen and began proclaiming, dictatorially and long-windedly, that this could only have happened because his attention had wandered for a moment. He blamed his failure in the third game on noise from the next room. He was unable to lose without immediately demanding a return match. At first, I was amused by this dogged pride, Finally, I accepted it as an unavoidable side effect of my real purpose, to lure the world champion to our table. On the third day, the plan succeeded, or partly. Whether Czentovic had looked through the porthole on the promenade deck and seen us in front of the chessboard, or had just happened to honor the smoking room with his presence, in any event, as soon as he saw two incompetents practicing his art, he was compelled to step closer, and while maintaining a careful distance, cast an appraising glance at our board. McConnor was just then making a move, and even this one move seemed to be enough to tell Czentovic that it would be unworthy of a master like him to take any further interest in our amateurish efforts. As naturally as any of us might toss aside a bad detective novel in a bookstore without even opening it, he walked away from our table and out of the smoking room. Weighed in the balance and found wanting, I thought, a little annoyed by this cool, contemptuous gaze. To somehow give vent to my ill humor, I said to McConnor, "The champion didn't seem to think much of your move." "What champion?" I explained to him that the gentleman who had just passed by and looked with such disapproval at our game was the chess champion Czentovic. Well, I added, the two of us would get over it, would come to terms with his lofty contempt without heartache. Beggars couldn't be choosers. But my offhand remark had a surprising and completely unexpected effect on McConnor. He immediately became agitated and forgot our game. You could almost hear the throbbing of his pride. He had had no idea that Czentovic was on board. Czentovic absolutely had to play him. He had never in his life played against a world champion, except once in a simultaneous game with 40 others. Even that had been terribly exciting, and he had almost won. Did I know the champion personally? I said I didn't. Wouldn't I talk to him and ask him over? I refused on the grounds that, to the best of my knowledge, Czentovic was not very open to making new acquaintances. Besides, what would tempt a world champion to bother with third-rate players like us? Now, I should never have made that remark about third-rate players to someone as proud as McConnor. He sat back in anger and brusquely declared that he, for his part, could not believe that Czentovic would refuse an invitation from a gentleman. He would see to that. At his request, I provided him with a brief description of the world champion, and, abandoning our board, he rushed after Czentovic along the promenade deck with unbridled impatience. I felt again that anyone with such broad shoulders was not to be deterred once he had put his mind to something. I waited in some anxiety. After 10 minutes, McConnor returned. He was not in good spirits, it seemed to me. "Well?" I asked. "You were right," he responded with some annoyance. Not a very pleasant gentleman. I introduced myself, told him who I was. He didn't even care to shake hands. I tried to explain to him how honored and proud all of us here on board would be if he would play us in a simultaneous game. But he was damn stiff-necked about it, said he was sorry, but he had contracted obligations toward his agent, expressly prohibiting him from playing without a fee during his tour. He says his minimum is $250 a game. I laughed. Who would have thought that pushing black and white pieces around was such a lucrative business? Well, I hope you took your leave just as politely. But McConnor was deadly earnest. The game is set for tomorrow afternoon at 3. Here, in the smoking lounge. I hope we won't let ourselves be thrashed too easily. What? You gave him $250? I exclaimed in consternation. Why not? C'est son métier. If I had a toothache and there happened to be a dentist on board, I wouldn't ask him to pull my tooth free of charge. The man is quite right to set hefty prices. In every field, the real experts are also the best at business. And as far as I'm concerned, The more straightforward the deal, the better. I'd rather pay cash than have Mr. Czentovic do me a favor and be obliged to him. Anyway, I've lost more than $250 in an evening at our club, and I wasn't playing a world champion. For third-rate players, it's no disgrace to be flattened by a Czentovic. I was amused to see how deeply I had wounded McConnor's self-esteem with that single innocent phrase, third-rate player. But as he was of a mind to pay for the expensive business, I wasn't about to find fault with his misplaced pride, which would enable me to meet the object of my curiosity at last. We lost no time in informing the 4 or 5 gentlemen who had identified themselves as chess players of the impending event, and, in advance of the match, we reserved not only our table, but the adjoining ones too, so as to minimize any disruption by people passing through. The next day, our little group turned out at the appointed hour in full strength. The central seat, opposite the champion, was, of course, assigned to McConnor, who eased his nerve by lighting one strong cigar after another, and restlessly checking the time again and again. But the world champion kept us waiting for a good 10 minutes. I had had a presentiment of something of the kind from my friend's tales, which only heightened the effect of his poised entrance. He walked calmly and coolly to the table. Without introducing himself, "You know who I am, and who you are is of no interest to me," this rudeness seemed to say, he embarked with professional dryness on the technical arrangements. As the unavailability of chessboards on the ship made a simultaneous game impossible, he said, he proposed to play us all jointly. After each move, he would repair to a table at the other end of the room, in order not to disturb our consultations. Once we had made our own move, we would tap on a glass with a spoon. Unfortunately, we didn't have a bell. He suggested a 10-minute maximum for a move, unless we had another thought. Like bashful schoolboys, we agreed to everything. Czentovic drew black. He made the first counter-move while still on his feet, and immediately went to wait in the spot he had suggested, where, casually hunched over, he leafed through an illustrated magazine. There is little reason to describe the game. It ended, as it had to, in our total defeat, after only 24 moves. In and of itself, it was hardly surprising that a world chess champion had dispatched a half-dozen average or below-average players with his left hand. What was so depressing to us was the overpowering way in which Czentovic made us feel all too clearly that he was doing just that. He would cast a single, seemingly cursory glance at the board before each move, looking past us as indifferently as if we ourselves were lifeless wooden pieces. It was a rude gesture that irresistibly recalled someone averting his eyes while tossing a scrap to a mangy dog. With a bit of sensitivity, he could have drawn our attention to mistakes, or bucked us up with a friendly word, in my opinion. But even when the game was over, this chess automaton uttered not a syllable after saying, "Mate," but simply waited motionless in front of the board in case we wanted a second game. I had already stood up, clumsy as one always is when faced with crass bad manners, in an attempt to indicate that, with the conclusion of this cash transaction, the pleasure of our acquaintance was at an end, at least as far as I was concerned. But to my annoyance, I heard the rather hoarse voice of McConnor next to me. "Rematch." The sheer provocation in his tone startled me. In fact, McConnor at that moment looked more like a boxer about to throw a punch than a polite gentleman. Whether because of Czentovic's unpleasant behavior or merely his own pathologically touchy pride, McConnor was in any case completely changed. Red to the roots of his hair, nostrils flared with the strength of his feeling, he was perspiring visibly, and a sharp crease ran between his firmly set lips and his aggressively jutting chin. I recognized uneasily in his eyes that flicker of uncontrolled passion that, for the most part, only grips people when they are at the roulette table and the right color hasn't come up 6 or 7 times running, the stakes doubling and redoubling all the while. At that instant, I knew that, regardless of the stakes, this fanatically proud man would go on playing Czentovic until he had won at least once, even if it cost him his entire fortune. If Czentovic stuck it out, he had found in McConnor a gold mine from which he could shovel dollars by the thousands all the way to Buenos Aires. Czentovic remained impassive. "As you wish," he responded politely. "The gentleman will now play black." The second game went much as the first, except that some curious onlookers both swelled and enlivened our group. McConnor gazed so fixedly at the board that it was as if he was trying to magnetize the pieces with his will to win. I knew that he would happily have sacrificed even $1,000 for the pleasure of shouting "mate" at his heartless adversary. Strange to say, we were all unconsciously picking up some of his determined agitation. We discussed each move with much greater passion than before, restraining each other until the last minute before agreeing to give the signal that summoned Czentovic back to our table. Little by little, we had arrived at the 37th move, and to our surprise, our position seemed amazingly advantageous, because we had succeeded in advancing the pawn in file C to the penultimate square C2. We needed only to move it to C1 to win a new queen. Not that we were smug about this all-too-obvious opportunity. We were unanimous in suspecting that this apparent advantage must be a trap set by Czentovic, who did, after all, have a much broader view of the situation. But despite strenuous general study and discussion, we were unable to discover the subterfuge. Finally, just as our time was expiring, we decided to risk it. McConnor had his hand on the pawn to move it to the last square when he felt his arm abruptly seized, and someone said in a faint, urgent whisper, "For God's sake, don't." Involuntarily, we all turned. It was a gentleman of about 45, whose long, sharp-featured face and strange, almost chalky pallor had caught my attention on the promenade deck. He must have come up during the last few minutes, while all our attention was on our problem. Feeling our gaze upon him, he added quickly, "If you make a queen now, he'll take her immediately with bishop to C1, and you'll take his bishop with your knight. But he'll be moving his free pawn to D7 to threaten your rook, and even if you check with your knight, you'll lose. You'll be done for in 9 or 10 moves. It's almost the same as the combination that Alekhine introduced against Bogolyubov in the Pistian Grand Tournament of 1922. Astonished, McConnor let his hand drop from the piece and stared with no less awe than the rest of us at the man who had unexpectedly come to our aid like an angel from heaven. Anyone who could calculate a checkmate 9 moves ahead had to be an expert of the first rank, perhaps even a competitor for the championship traveling to the same tournament. There was something supernatural about his sudden appearance and intervention at such a critical juncture. McConnor was the first to recover his wits. "What would you advise?" he whispered excitedly. "Don't advance just yet. First, take evasive action. The main thing is to move your king out of the endangered file from G8 to H7. Then he'll probably shift his attack to the other flank. But you can parry that with rook C8 to C4. That will cost him 2 tempi, a pawn, and thus his advantage. Then it'll be your free pawn against his, and if you maintain a proper defense, you'll manage a draw. That's the best you can hope for. Once more we were astounded. There was something bewildering about both the precision and the speed of his calculations. It was as though he saw the moves printed in a book. In any event, his intervention and the unanticipated opportunity to draw against a world champion had a magical effect. We moved aside as one to give him a clearer view of the board. Again, McConnor asked, "So king g8 to h7? Right. The main thing is to keep in the clear." McConnor did as he was told, and we tapped on the glass. Czentovic strode over to our table with his usual composure and assessed our move with one glance. He then moved his king's pawn h2 to h4, exactly as predicted by our unknown collaborator, who was already whispering excitedly, advance the rook, c8 to c4. Then we'll have to cover his pawn first. But that won't help him. You'll capture it with your knight d3 to e5. No need to worry about his free pawn, and you'll be on an even footing again. Press the attack, stop defending. We did not understand this. It was Greek to us. But McConnor was under his spell, and again, obeyed automatically. We tapped on the glass once more to summon Czentovic. For the first time, he did not decide quickly, but studied the board with furrowed brow. He then made precisely the move foretold by the stranger and turned to go. But before he walked away, something new and unexpected happened. Czentovic raised his eyes and reviewed our ranks. He evidently wished to discover who was suddenly putting up such energetic resistance. From that moment on, our excitement grew beyond measure. Until then, we had played without any serious hope, but now the idea of breaking Czentovic's cold arrogance quickened all our pulses. Our new friend had already indicated the next move, and we were ready to summon Czentovic. My fingers trembled as I struck the glass with the spoon. And now came our first triumph. Czentovic, who until then had always played on his feet, hesitated, and finally sat down. He sat down slowly and ponderously, but with this movement alone, the former de haut en bas inequality between us had been abolished. We had brought him down to our level, at least in a physical sense. He thought a long time, his eyes fixed on the board and downcast, so that his pupils were hardly visible under the shadowed lids, and as he did, his mouth gradually fell open, giving his round face a somewhat simple-minded appearance. Czentovic meditated intensely for some minutes, then made his move and rose. And already our friend was whispering, "He's stalling. Good thinking. But pay no attention. Force an exchange at all costs. Then we could draw, and not even God can help him." McConnor did as he was told. The next few moves were an incomprehensible give and take between the two antagonists. The rest of us had long since become mere supernumeraries. Some 7 moves later, Czentovic looked up after long thought and said, "Draw." For a moment, there was complete silence. You could suddenly hear the murmur of the waves, the jazz from the radio in the lounge, every footstep from the promenade deck, and the faint, delicate whistling of the wind through the cracks in the windows. Nobody breathed. It had happened too suddenly, and all of us were still almost in a state of shock after this improbable occurrence. This stranger, had imposed his will on the world champion in a game that was half lost. McConnor leaned back suddenly, and the breath he had been holding escaped from his lips with a delighted, "Ah." I then observed Czentovic. During the last few moves, it seemed to me that he had become paler. But he had no difficulty in maintaining his self-possession. He kept up a serene front and merely asked in the most unconcerned way, as he smoothly pushed the pieces off the board, "Do the gentlemen wish a third game?" He asked the question in a purely professional, business-like manner. But this was the remarkable thing. Instead of looking at McConnor, he had sharply and directly raised his eyes to our benefactor. During the last moves, he must have recognized his real, his true opponent, just as a horse knows a new, better rider by the way he takes the saddle. Involuntarily, we followed his gaze, looking eagerly at the stranger. But before he had a chance to consider, much less respond, McConnor, bursting with pride and excitement, had called out triumphantly, "Of course, but now you have to play Czentovic by yourself. Just you against Czentovic." But now, something unforeseen happened. The stranger, who rather oddly was still staring intently at the empty chessboard, gave a start, feeling all eyes upon him and hearing himself addressed with such enthusiasm. He looked confused. Impossible, gentlemen," he stammered, visibly disconcerted. It's completely out of the question. You shouldn't even consider me. Oh, it's been 25 years since I sat down at a chessboard, and only now do I see my impertinence in meddling in your game without being asked. Please excuse me for being so presumptuous. I certainly won't bother you again." And before we could recover from our surprise, he had already walked away and left the room. "But this is incredible," boomed the temperamental McConnor, banging his fist on the table. "It can't be 25 years since this man played chess. He was calculating every move, every response 5-6 moves ahead. Nobody can do that off the top of his head. That's completely impossible. Isn't it?" As he asked this last question, McConnor had turned without thinking to Czentovic, but the world champion remained unflappable. I am unable to say. However, the gentleman's game was somewhat surprising and interesting. That is why I deliberately gave him a chance. Rising nonchalantly, he added in his professional manner, "If the gentleman, or you gentlemen, should wish another game tomorrow, I shall be at your service from 3 o'clock on." We could not suppress a faint smile. As we all knew, Czentovic had certainly not magnanimously given our unknown benefactor a chance, and this remark was nothing more than a simple-minded excuse for his own failure. Our desire to see such imperturbable arrogance brought low grew all the more fiercely. Peaceable, idle passengers though we were, we had suddenly been seized by a wild, ambitious bellicosity, tantalized and aroused by the thought that the palm might be wrested from the champion right here on this ship in the middle of the ocean, a feat that would then be telegraphed around the globe. There was also the allure of mystery, the effect of our benefactor's unexpected intervention just at the critical moment, and the contrast between his almost anxious diffidence and the imperturbable self-assurance of the professional. Who was this stranger? Had chance brought to light an as yet undiscovered chess genius? Or was he a renowned master who was concealing his identity from us for some unfathomable reason? We debated all these possibilities in a state of utmost excitement. Even the most daring hypotheses were not daring enough for us to square the stranger's puzzling timidity and surprising avowal with the unmistakable artfulness of his play. But on one point we were agreed. On no account would we forego the spectacle of a return engagement. We resolved to do everything to have our benefactor play against Czentovic the next day. McConnor agreed to bear the financial risk. In the meantime, it had been learned from the steward that the stranger was an Austrian. Thus it fell to me, as his compatriot, to convey our request. I soon found the man who had fled so hurriedly. He was on the promenade deck, reading in a deck chair. Before presenting myself, I took the opportunity to study him. The angular head rested in an attitude of mild fatigue on the cushion. I was again especially struck by the remarkable pallor of the comparatively young face, framed at the temples by blindingly white hair. I had the feeling, I don't know why, that this man must have aged abruptly. I had hardly approached him when he rose politely and introduced himself, using a name which was immediately familiar to me as that of a highly regarded old Austrian family. I recall that one of the bearers of this name had been part of Schubert's most intimate circle, and that one of the old Kaiser's personal physicians had descended from the same family. When I conveyed to Dr. B our request that he accept Czentovic's challenge, he was visibly astonished. As it turned out, he had had no idea that it was a world champion, in fact, the reigning one, against whom he had so magnificently held his own in that game. For some reason, this information seemed to make a special impression on him, for he had asked over and over if I was sure his opponent really was the acknowledged world champion. I soon found that this state of affairs made my task easier, and, aware of his sensitivity, considered it advisable to conceal from him only that the financial risk of possible defeat was being borne by McConnor. After hesitating for quite a while, Dr. B finally declared himself ready for a match, though not without expressly asking me to warn the other gentlemen that it was imperative not to place exaggerated hopes in his abilities. You see, he added with a pensive smile, I honestly don't know if I can play a proper chess game according to all the rules. Please believe me, it was absolutely not out of false modesty that I said I hadn't touched a chess piece since grammar school. That was more than 20 years ago, and even then, I wasn't considered a player of any particular talent. He said this so naturally that it was impossible to entertain the least doubt as to his sincerity. Nevertheless, I could not help but express my astonishment at the precision with which he had been able to remember every combination of moves played by a variety of chess masters. Surely he must have been much involved with chess theory, at least. Dr. B smiled once again in that oddly dreamy way. Much involved. God knows you'd have to say I was much involved with chess. But it happened under quite special, indeed entirely unique circumstances. It's a fairly complicated story, and one that might possibly be considered a small contribution to the delightful grand times we live in. If you will bear with me for half an hour. He had motioned toward the deck chair next to him. I gladly accepted his invitation. We had no neighbors,